Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. As a point of departure, I will start by saying we cannot underestimate how critical strong leadership is in all aspects of our lives. It enables us to run our lives, homes, communities, workplaces, and nations. Given its importance, it is pertinent to ask, what is the source of good leadership? Ladies and gentlemen, those are the words from the book written by Professor Tshilidzi Marwala in his latest book, Leadership Lessons from the Books I've Read. What is going to happen at this point in time is we will give our Dean of Students, Mr. Jerome September, to welcome and literally give a brief overview of why we have this postgraduate club and its importance and purpose thereof. Please feel free to engage as we go on with this conversation. Type in your questions in the Q&A section, and then with time, we'll then just engage the question. Mr. Jerome September, over to you.
Thank you, Palesa, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerome September, as you've just heard, Dean of Student Affairs here at Wits University. This postgraduate book club is an important initiative as we think about the development of our students, and particularly as we think about how we engage postgraduate students. Postgraduate students, of course, unlike undergrads, I assume, are deeper engaged in some of these bigger questions in our society. And at a research institution in particular, it is important that they take up space, as it were. So we formed this book club earlier this year, precisely to engage postgraduates, to have them think deeply, to have them challenge our own thinking around some of the key questions in our society. I am a personal fan of Prof Marwala's work, and so I am delighted to have him with us today, and in particular to help us think quite deeply about who we are, what we're about, but importantly, the lessons as leaders we can learn as we engage in reading. So as we think through this topic this afternoon, as we engage with this book, as we think about leadership, as we think about books on leadership, I am hoping that you will get many lessons out of this, but that you will, that it will spark a fire in you to read, to engage, and to learn on this journey. So thank you to Prof, and thank you to everyone who is here. Welcome to this book club.
Thank you so much for that, Dean. And it is important for us as young people to literally take up space, as you have rightfully said. And thank you so much for this book club, because I think it is through it we get to understand some of the issues that are pertaining to society and how we as young leaders, we can literally try and come up with solutions to that effect. Thank you for highlighting that important topic, Dean. All right, so now we are going to introduce our speaker, who is the author of the book. And Professor Marwala is an accomplished scholar with multiple disciplinary research interests that include the theory and application of artificial intelligence in engineering, computer science, finance, social science, and medicine. He has an extensive track record in human capacity development and has published 23 books in artificial intelligence. He holds a BSc in mechanical engineering, magna cum laude from Case Western Reserve University, a Master of Chemical Engineering from University of Pretoria, PhD in Engineering from University of Cambridge, and was a postdoctoral associate at Imperial College. Professor Marwala is the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Johannesburg, and prior to this, he was the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research and Internationalization and Executive Dean of Engineering and the Building Environment, both at the University of Johannesburg. He also served as the Deputy Chairperson of the Presidential Commission on the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Prof Marwala You are welcomed, and please do give us your 2 cents as far as the book is concerned, and just an overview as far as the book. So please take us through your thinking process as to what really inspired you into writing this very important book where the whole world literally finds themselves in a position of leadership. Prof Marwala, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Palisa. I hope everybody can hear me. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of Jerome September, and also I would just like to emphasize that I actually started my academic career as a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at Wits University. So it is actually quite nice for me to be back in different format, of course. So maybe I should just talk about the evolution of me being able to write such a multidisciplinary book. You know, firstly, I have written many books full of mathematical equations, and I have always wondered whether these books that I'm writing are accessible to our people here in South Africa. People who are not necessarily educated in the engineering discipline. And the second part is that when I finished high school in the northern part of this country, in Limpopo province, during the dark days of apartheid, you are very young, you wouldn't even understand what I'm talking about. At that point, I had a citizenship. I can see somebody is even revealing the school which I attended. I had a citizenship of a fictitious nation called the Republic of Venda. You know, it was fictitious because it was not recognized by anybody else except the so-called Republic of South Africa. So, and when I finished at Mbiri Secondary School, there was this belief that people who got the so-called Bantu education, which we got, should not go directly to university. So if they come to Wits, they will do something called pre-university program. If they went to University of Cape Town, they will actually do something called aspect. So when I finished high school, firstly, I had a glimpse of how the world looks like, because I was a science Olympiad winner. So I spent 2 weeks in England in 1989 when I was doing matric. So when I came back, I had an interest of completing my academic program in the United Kingdom. So when I was in matric, somebody from Shell, who actually happens to be the head of Wits Business School today, came to our high school. He must have been very, very young because he still looks very young. Maurice Khadebe came to my high school and said he was going to give me a scholarship to do A-levels. You know, so I ended up doing A-levels here in Johannesburg, and then I proceeded to the University of Cape Town. So I was quite aware of how the engineering curriculum in Cape Town looks like. But I transferred to United States, and the first shocking thing about United States, which obviously is the genesis of this book, they told me that even though you are doing mechanical engineering, you have to take 12 human and social sciences courses. You know, you have to take human and social sciences courses. So that was the birth of multidisciplinary thinking. I took psychology, I took literature, I took acting, you know, and so on and so forth. So now, what was the reason? Why was the reason why I took this book? I wrote this book. Firstly, I was concerned about the culture of reading in South Africa. Many of the people no longer read. So what I did as a vice chancellor, was to introduce something called a Vice Chancellor's Reading Club, where every month I read a book for staff and students. And you can imagine how many books you can read. It's effectively 10 books you can read per year. And in 3 years, you are already talking about 30. You are already talking about 30 books. And I have actually been a vice chancellor for 4 years. So I have read many books. So now, I wanted to divide these books into a number of theses. The first one, themes. The first one was books on Africa and the diaspora. So this will be classic books, Things Fall Apart, and so on and so forth. So I have 17 books on just Africa and its diaspora. I have one exception there, which is the first chapter. It is on Africa, but not necessarily written by an African or in anybody in the African diaspora. In fact, it is written by a Polish person, which is Heart of Darkness. Otherwise, the books are written by authors of Africa or authors of people of African descent. Then the second part was a book that was a series of books that I wrote about the genesis of our modern society. So this will be books such as Politics, Aristotle, The Prince, a famous book that was written in the 15th century by Machiavelli. So these are the books that are included there. Then, of course, I couldn't leave science, technology, and society. I had to write to also include many books on science. Thinking Fast and Slow, one of my favorite books. All of them are my favorite books. The book, The Structure of Scientific Discovery, which is actually written by Thomas Kuhn, and he introduced to the English language the expression, the paradigm shift in that book. The South African classic called The Soul of the White Ant. It was actually originally written in Afrikaans, which basically studies the behavior of termites in the Waterberg area. And then finally, I had books on leaders, Barack Obama, Xi Jinping, and so on and so forth. So this is really what the book is about. And in each book, I am drawing leadership lessons that I believe are important for our society to move forward. And out of these 50 books that I cover in this book, I draw a major lesson from each. So in the conclusion, I outline 50 leadership lessons that I have drawn from these 50 books. So this is really what this is all about. And I will give Alisa back to you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that brief overview as to what really inspired the whole writing behind the book, and just taking us through the whole summary as to what informed each and every section. All right, thank you so much for that. So right now, I will literally hand over to our panelists. But before I do that, let me just highlight that to our audience to say, please do ensure that you use the chat box to just, put out your generic comments. And then there is a Q&A section where you can post your comments or questions to the panelists and or our speaker for today. All right. So at the end of this webinar, what's going to happen is we have books that are going to be given. However, those books are limited to only the students. So yes, we are going to literally give away books, but at the end of this session, it will be limited to those from the Wits University. And we'll then leave it to Tembi, who is in the Dean's office, to then just hand over the books as to who she sees would have gotten the book. All right. So in this very same part, second part rather of this webinar, we'll then be introducing our speakers. As a point of departure from that point on, I'd like to highlight that each speaker has got 10 minutes to just give us their thoughts and review as far as this book is concerned. Our first panelist will be Karaba, right? Karaba is a journalist and facilitator who works with writers and academics in the humanities to give their work a public life. She believes that engagement in social and cultural issues contributes significantly to the transformation of individuals and communities across geopolitical borders. Karaba is a recipient of the South African Literary Award for Journalism and is a sought-after speaker on storytelling as central to public intellectual and cultural life. She has also adjudicated prestigious literary awards and worked on selection panels for short story anthologies. She worked as books editor for City Press, talk show host at SAFM and Talk Radio 702, and at the Department of Arts and Culture as Deputy Director, Books and Publishing Department, that is. She holds a BA Honors in Migration and Displacement and is currently pursuing her MA in the same field in the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of the Witwatersrand. Karaba, over to you. And then afterwards, I will then introduce our second panelist. Please ensure that you use your 10 minutes very, very wisely. Karaba, over to you.
Thank you very much, Palesa, and greetings to our esteemed guest, Professor Tshilidzi Marwala, and our esteemed Dean of Students and the rest of the team at the office, as well as to my co-panelist, Trevor, and especially to my prized fellow postgraduate students, all protocol observed. My thoughts on leadership lessons from books I have read looks at some of the implications of these lessons from a practical social justice perspective, but I will try not to be too heavy on theoretical frameworks in the interest of time and keeping your attention this evening. The book is easy to digest, even though the ideas that Professor Marwala puts forward about how society got here, while it provides powerful suggestions for using 4IR with sage leadership in order to face our challenges. What I found to be delightful, considering the onslaught in the war for our attention, combined with the mental and psychological languishing that many of us are facing due to isolation with the pandemic and interrupted digital access, including the brightest minds among us, is that this book is not necessary to read in chronological order. Neither is it necessary to attempt it in one sitting. One can dip in and out of different sections, and reading the book is a leisurely experience, even as it provides a healthier dopamine hit from a geeking out experience. I love geeking out, and to combine the different disciplines the way that Professor Marwala has done that in this book for me was, learning and having fun, but also taking a deeper dive and reading a different perspective from areas outside of which I usually specialize. Indeed, it is apparent that with too few exceptions, the world is facing a leadership crisis. And as South Africa, due to form, if we're not a good example, we are a horrible warning. Many of us seek postgraduate education, particularly in the humanities, as I'm biased that way, as part of a personal search for meaning, which we know is not the most attractive investment for funders. This is ironic because understanding what and who we are is part of striving for human progress. Dialogue between disciplines is essential in this regard, so I was deeply gratified that the first section of leadership lessons I have learned from books I have read looks to literature about Africa and the diaspora, with fiction playing a significant role. History, memory, rearranging yesterday for the sake of tomorrow in the context of the Fourth Industrial Revolution on this continent is essential because, as Prof Marwala argues, he argues for rational choices to be made for good so that our young population can use their vibrant energy to emancipate themselves from the margins of society. I say they, not as to other, but my visa for youth has expired. And I was intrigued by reading about exothermic languages, for example, and the crisis that many languages are facing in terms of endangerment. Prof Marwala's suggestion for a linguistic economy of scale in Africa that the continent should have a group of core languages in order to drive innovation is compelling as it is potentially controversial, especially when it comes from an individual whose own language of his childhood and life world is an endangered one, Tshivenda. It is well documented that linguistic apartheid does not only contribute to socioeconomic exclusion, it is a violation of the soul of a people. The question I have in this regard is whether 4IR has the potential to go back in linguistic time to help us reclaim what we have lost. Can 4IR help us reclaim our lost memories, our lost selves, in terms of significant human endeavor and experience that wasn't written down in the history book? And what would that entail? As a student of mobility, human mobility and the politics of belonging, a considerable amount of my research is on the manifestation of temporal injustice and how our cities are governed in the context of migrant populations. This is important because Africa is becoming increasingly urbanized, with many young people having lived most of their lives in informal contexts, having limited access to social goods and protection, and whose only encounter with the state is hostile and punitive, containment and control. And the COVID-19 pandemic shone a glaring spotlight on the issue. When people cannot move, they cannot find opportunity. And with the levels of digital inequality that exist, well, there needs no explanation for that for those of us in this virtual room. The outcomes have been dire. When you keep people waiting for digital migration of our broadcasting spectrum, for a decent education, for shelter, you're effectively using time against them. They struggle to achieve age-based goals and just a decent time on earth. And that is a form of injustice. So I am interested in the role of 4IR and how we can address injustice over past and present time. I would also like to know Prof's thoughts on how countries also use time zones to exercise power over their populations. A really big example is Beijing, which insists that its entire geopolitical territory keeps a single standard time zone, even though the country spreads physically across 5 of them. Section B on searching for the ideal polity looks at the work of statesmen, and boy, the testosterone just drips off those pages, and political and social theorists, and George Orwell, because, well, we are in the future now. Reading this section gave me pause to reflect on whether and how deep learning can solve the political problems of leadership. When men use machines to win elections, when some known and unknown Twitter accounts and unknown dirty dozens can use social networks to destabilize key regions, as it happened in KZN and Gauteng's East Rand in July. What happens when they shut down or restrict the internet so that their citizen subjects cannot seek solidarity by sharing their plight with the world? When the largest means of free communication is not that free because it is owned by a handful of men who do not pay taxes, who violate antitrust regulations everywhere, and we pay with our privacy. How do we then play catch up and turn it around so that business and political leadership, because same WhatsApp and WeChat group, how do we ensure that such leadership becomes based on virtue over vice? These are the questions that Professor Marwala's book gave me pause to reflect on and to think about when I conduct myself in my everyday activities, and especially in my scholarship, am I thinking about those in a kind of larger scale with the implications of information age? Some solutions that Professor suggests appear to be presented in a way that may appear to obscure the social political injustice element. The promise that is that the machines would work with us. Or apart from research that makes bank, what of the rare data that doesn't receive funding? I'm thinking elegance, art, intuition. Is it possible to explain away every mystery that makes us who we are? And if that's the case, are we in danger of losing magic? I'm not talking about finding romance in dating apps, but some kind of spiritual life, or for the non-spiritual folks, a deeper connection between myself and my real life communities, which often takes place through the shared experience of art. Professor Marwala makes a very profound argument for the role that religion and spirituality could play in that regard. If there is a future in which 4IR and in which 4IR can duplicate the healthier neural pathways that replace the excessive dopamine rush from our relationship with machines today, then I'm all in. One aspect that I would have liked to look at in more detail is that of gender-based violence, as crimes against property are treated more harshly than crimes against women, children, and gendered minorities. Obviously, I am also informed by my own lived experience of obstetric violence, gender-based violence, of racial and gender wage disparity. And although South Africa provides care and rights for me on paper, I can tell you now that today, even private clinics have run out of a contraceptive that the state is meant to provide for free, but access has been profoundly curtailed by COVID measures. The fallout of bad leadership has and continues to be felt in gendered ways. I think it was the comedian Hassan Minaj who commented on China's rolling back of the one-child policy in order to address low birth rates and the defunding of Planned Parenthood and the repealing of abortion laws in the US. He said, one side wants gynecological, those are my parentheses, women to have babies, and the other wants us to keep them. And literally nobody is checking whether that's okay with us. Would machines be able to intervene in that regard? Now, the lack of research into reproductive health care, the exclusion of women from computer science, even though they dominated the field at the start, is that if 4IR does not have the investment into the issues that affect us in all gendered minorities, means that we will continue to have negative health and life outcomes as we have witnessed regression in protecting our reproductive choices and health. I look forward to seeing the developments in this regard, and I think that the book provides a good kind of basic sort of material historical groundwork to help us think about how we're going to grapple these issues going forward. I'm ending. All in all, leadership lessons is like crib notes, and I know our supervisors might not approve, but it is a valuable asset, not just for us as aspiring scholars, but for the rest of our society who do not have the benefit of our privilege as postgraduate students. I encourage that it be shared with everyone because everybody plays a role in the leadership of our society. Thank you.
Melissa, you are on mute.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Sisti. All right. So, Karaba, thank you so much for that review and just giving us your thoughts as far as the book is concerned. You did raise some critical questions for Prof. I think for now, let me just look into the chat box to see if whether there are any questions for you to this effect, and then we can move on to our second speaker. All right, let me just see there now. All right, so there is a comment from Zabo, and they're saying, critical thoughts coming through from Holeng. I look forward to hearing what Prof Marwala thinks. All right, that is very, very good. And then there is a question to Prof. I think that question we can always have it when we have the Prof just responding to everything as far as this review is concerned. All right, second up, we have our second speaker to just give us his thoughts as far as this book is concerned. And our second panelist is Trevor Mutsonga. All right, Trevor Mutsonga is a consultant art creative director, dramaturg, photographer, and researcher. His current research project focuses on commercialization experiences of digital platforms by Southern Africa-based musicians. Trevor is passionate about the creative economy, arts and culture, intellectual property approaches, and arts, culture, business, economic institutions in particular. He holds a BTech with honors in creative arts and design from CUT in 2009, honors in applied drama, Wits University, and MA in arts and culture management from Wits in 2019. Trevor is currently reading for a PhD in arts and culture management in the Wits School of the Arts, Cultural Policy and Management, where he also serves as an academic intern. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Trevor to give us his 2 cents as far as the book is concerned. Trevor, please know that you do have 10 minutes as likewise. You may take the stage.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. And I'll go straight into it. And so reading this book, it's been quite interesting reading it. I've been sitting with a lot of tensions in it. So to start off, we'll find that Professor Marwala within this book adopts a thesis of that the source of leadership is knowledge and the source of knowledge is experience. And in this book, it's an easy read. And you'd find that up front, it lives up to that, where he's a man who puts knowledge up front as that from knowledge, there we get good leadership. And this speaks to a concept and a perspective that leadership is about cultivating, developing leaders, that leaders are not born. Yes, the confidence and there might be, the oratory might be based on biology and the environment, but the actual qualities of how to lead, how to govern, how to be a good steward, those qualities are inculcated. So it's an interesting book when you look at the first section within the African diaspora. That's where I found myself sitting with a lot of tension. And the tension comes in with, when you look at the book, as if you look at the author, that you've got Africans in the diaspora, Africans educated within the diaspora, who then have become very reflective of particularly governance at home, the politics, the social economics, because they are now in a new context, in a new environment where things are done differently, where by moving to these new states and new places, it sort of disrupts the stability and the way things have always been done at home. It gives one the room and platform to be critical of the things that are sacrosanct to you and that you would not question. Like most people love to throw the expression that this is an African, but you find within the diaspora and living and experiencing life within the diaspora helps people to rethink the context of leadership. And you find within this book, it helps and challenges that. And he also throws in his own experiences of having stayed in the diaspora and worked in the diaspora. So in a way, you find that it's not only about leadership lessons, that you get nuggets of the author bringing in his own as an autobiology within the biography within the book. And one of the things that I found myself looking and grappling with, particularly within the nexus of being in the diaspora myself and the ones at home, is the tension that you express of belonging, of being, and that you find when in the lessons in the chapters 11, where he looks at Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, chapter 13, also to pick a few, and Novel, which we need, Bulawayo, we need new names, and chapter 15, where you're looking at this moneyball body. And then we take it all to the last section on leading nations, that you begin to look at this men, particularly when you're looking at the Chinese example, you're looking at men who were strong-willed to a greater extent. In modern day, we might say they had dictatorial tendencies, but because they had a vision for a shared political consensus that they were driving and leading their countries to, then we now have China as a global giant that it is today. But it took leaders who had to take a stand and almost march everyone into that direction with dire consequences if we're looking into after the era led by Dan. So when you're looking at this book and how it's very multidisciplinary, you begin to realize that actually the case that we have, particularly on the African continent, of why, when it's easy to say we have a leadership crisis, but the question that I find that this book does not upfront give, but you find it there, is then how do we address the African question on leadership? How do we begin to address it? And by reading this book, and that is 50 lessons, you begin to realize that it's complex and it's not as easy as it appears. That's why even as within the region, we fail to agree. There's the issue of what's happening in Eswatini, but you find that people are asking, where is SADC? And you realize that actually leadership is very complex. Southern Africa as a region is very complex. The whole of Africa as a continent is very complex. The world is a complex place that we're in. And you find, for me, I find in this book, the theme that you find that it's as if the author is then beginning to say, maybe all these complexities, how about we look into the fourth industrial revolution? But within the book, he then also tells us, but also when you look at Africa, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to access to the internet itself, we're lagging behind. So how do we then use this? There's an opportunity in 4IR to change and work within that. But already when you're coming in on a back foot, it means that might not be an opportunity that we might be able to make the most of. But one of the things that I find, and I'm curious also at Prof on this one, because now bringing in my arts and institutional, particularly creative economy background, of where in one of the chapters it speaks of when we have histories and monuments that pay to, I'll call it a disputed history, that one of his suggestions is to use museums as a place where we say, okay, we don't want an example of statues, that we're not going to honor this part of history that was very suppressive to the majority if we're looking in the African case. But let's not destroy them, let's put them in museums. And for me, I sit in this place where I'm wondering to say, so Prof, when we're looking into that, are you saying that the role of the arts and culture is purely that of instrumental to get to an end, where we're saying it's a difficult question or difficult solution that needs a decisive action, but we're afraid to take the decision. So as a way of a compromise, let's put it in a museum so that no one is seen as being anti, no one is seen as looking at, is it about restitution? Is it about paying reparations? What is it about that now we then put museums? And this I ask because we're in an environment where the role of museums, particularly on the African continent, is increasingly being questioned because they're not serving what, when they were established, mostly these were former colonial institutions. How do we then make use of that as institutions before we even say we want to put former colonial statues into the museum? So that's one of the things. And back to that comes in with about leadership when we look at leading nations, that when we look at one of the, I would say the ways that China began to adjust and be the China that we have, was taking on the principle of advancements in culture, that apart from just economic advancement, they also had a very central role in advancements in culture and political consensus. But that, then to them, it was not only simply culture as a way of trying to sweet talk the tensions, but it's really an advancement in culture in looking at, yes, the role of technology speaks to that, but actually taking the culture not only for ourselves, but to the world. And also with that, the intrinsic value of what does it mean to be Chinese, and looking at not just Chinese being about culture, but being about dipping into looking at history, into the civilization of it. And then one of the other things that I looked at and I begin to ask and look, and this is skipping right to the last section of looking at leading nations, and I also look at the leaders and the books that you have read. And I find myself sitting with the question of, don't we have African leadership examples? They might not be political, but don't we have also new names? Don't we have new names? Don't we have beautiful ones who we can look to and say these men and women can help us to rethink about how to lead nations? Are we always going to go to the other countries? Yes, one might argue that there's, when you're looking at America and China, where, because the presidents and the leaders are mostly American and Chinese that are quoted in the last section, but it made me begin to think that then what's happening in Botswana, where in the region, people are looking at the succession plans that happen in Botswana. Is there anything to look at that? What about Mauritius that's growing economically? Is there anything to look at that? What about the case of King Moshoeshoe II in Lesotho and the negotiation between him then having to go into some, today we would say into exile into Europe, and then coming back and signing of the role of monarchy into the modern day Lesotho? Are they lessons, their leadership lessons? Are we always going to be looking to the worst for some of this, the lessons? So for me, it was always these themes that when I leave the first section, most of it becomes, I see the author was very much within the African diaspora, and I begin to ask myself, is it a case of nostalgia, of saying, maybe it worked there, could it work here? Or is there room for African solutions to African issues? So it's a great book. I enjoyed reading this book, and I found myself, particularly on the religion and politics, I found myself chapter 26. It became a book that I want to read and look into. And I think for now, I think I'm in a space where I'm still sitting with lots of things as I look into this, but it's a very interesting book, particularly how you approached the multidisciplinary. And it's very also important for me as I end now to also highlight that this book it's important for me to acknowledge that these are leadership lessons for the professor, and he has been generous enough to share with us. So these questions are not about me being critical of the lessons that the professor has learned in the book, but are more, I think, more for myself, not the professor, the lessons I'm coming with. So thank you very much. You are muted, Palesa.
Thank you so much for that. Trevor, thank you so much for that, Trevor and Karaba. So I think it is at this point where I'm going to ask both of you to put on your videos so we can just have a discussion that is, face to face. Because I do have a question for both of you. Karaba, you did speak about, representation as far as your review is concerned, of the book is concerned. So I need to know from you. And probably before I do that, let me just quote from the book itself when it comes to representation of women as far as, leadership is concerned. So Prof says, history echoes women or society. History echoes society in characterizing women as nurturers, providers, and supporters. While these are admirable qualities, the absolute courage and valor demonstrated by women are drowned by a collage of male heroes who saved the day. So Karaba, this question goes to you to say, okay, what do you think is missing as far as the female voice is concerned within this book? Karaba, are you still with us, ma'am?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to unmute. Eish, I can never get used to this 18 months down the line. I think it would be grossly unfair for me to put all of the pressure on Professor Marwala to be representative of women's experience because he doesn't have those experiences, right? So what I'm saying is that, I'm putting this as a challenge for myself and for other women and people of gender minorities to take up space in these particular spaces. I'll give you an example of a technology company called Think, spelled with an X, which is a menstrual technology company, who are fighting for access to improved menstrual technology. We cannot have a situation where for 70 years, we've been able to go to the moon, put satellites in space, talk in real time like this, but we're still using the same menstrual technology that not only causes environmental degradation, but for the most part does not contribute to our health and well-being. It's like you're just putting a stopgap. And it also has in terms of our education, and even when we get to make reproductive choices, right? So it's when social scientists and gender theorists speak about intersectionality, especially when we speak as Black women, right? Because that's how I identify as an African Black woman. Is that when we start to even think about technologies, that we need to also shake the table. So for me, it's not. I'm using this book as a reminder that we have a challenge, that we need to shake the table and make noise in the room regarding that. And when you look at, when Hollywood will doff the head once in a while to the Black women who are part of the NASA space program, it's like, but then what? Because one swallow does not make the spring. And I think with that, when we deal with the kind of patriarchal leadership that actually brings on patriarchal princesses who think that just because these men are protecting them, that they're safe, And I think these are challenges where this book is actually reminding me to also stay in that struggle. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I think you just touched on some very important points to say, we cannot put the issue of representation on Prof because why the limits that come with that very same question. All right, I think Trevor, so that we can just give Prof a right of reply, if I may call it that. Please, you spoke about the complexities, around leadership, right? So in addressing the complexities around leadership and African leadership in particular, how has this book, in terms of your reading, literally help you position or even define good leadership as far as African leadership is concerned, given the complexities?
So one of the things that this book very puts up front, and its interwoven theme, is about meritocracy and leaders coming in because they qualify, because they are the best candidate for the position. And so
Yes.
while that is a solution on one end, on the other end, in other parts of the book also speaks to it, that when you challenge systems that are ingrained, they can be very violent. So it's a solution that comes with a caveat to say, here is one way of doing it. We need new names, we need new leaders, we need the beautiful ones. We need a rigorous system of how do we select leaders. And when I look at the South African example, people are already asking, when I look at the work that's being done now, people are going to local government elections, is to say, actually, the way we elect leaders within the South African context, is that the way of doing it, or is there a different way where people elect leaders directly at all levels? So those are some of the ways that when I listen to what's happening and then what the book is saying, it's really saying that we need standards of how do we create meritocracy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. All right, within the chat box, I see that there is some good movement, and I think let's just give Prof Marwala an opportunity to respond, to the very much the good insights from our panelists, so that we can just have the Q&A session afterwards. Prof Marwala, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will start with Karaba. I agree with everything that you have said. There's nothing that I dispute. Part of the reason I think women issues are best represented by women. This is the second book that I wrote this year. I wrote a first book titled Leadership Leading in the 21st Century. And in Leading in the 21st Century, I try. And as a man, I don't really have the experience to be able to represent or even talk about the attributes of women leaders as competently as a woman author will be able to do. For example, in that book, I talk about Charlotte McClarkin, inspiring woman. And of course, what people don't know is that she ended up in America because a white gentleman who had taken the choir to New York disappeared on them in the 18th century. I talk about the Rain Queen, a big representation of women of leadership in Southern Africa. And then I also talk about Marie Curie, the only person to win 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, physics and chemistry, and basically the mother of nuclear technology. I talk about Helen Joseph, our struggle icon, but I would like to also confess that I did feel inadequate despite all the reading that I've done, whether I have done a good job. Maybe just to talk about after writing this book, there were books that I would have removed from my list. If I were to rewrite the book, there are 3 books that I would include. I think the first book that I would include is The Man of the People. Because if you look at our political problems, there's always a man of the people somewhere who is very much liked, but his actions, and it's his action because it has been man. I must confess, the women leaders in Africa have been very, very exemplary. If you look at President Banda in Malawi, if you look into West Africa, our Nobel Prize winner, they have actually been exemplary. There's always a man of the people who actually does not love his people, will make choices that are against the interest of his people. And I think as we move in this century and we get many women of the people, we are going to see much, much better resolution to many of the problems that we face. Now, I will touch on the issue of gender-based violence. Karaba raised the issue of gender-based violence, And of course, there's a difficult book, Chimamanda, Purple, Hibiscus, about abuse, about violence in our homes. And nobody talks about it. Everybody knows, but everybody is silent about it. And this is actually a contemporary story about South Africa. I mean, when I, as a Vice Chancellor, I have to deal with many issues of gender-based violence, even including leading to death. And there is one thing in common, and that concerns me, that there is always a role of a man as a perpetrator. You know, I rarely see cases where women are perpetrators. You know, so there is something that needs to be fixed in our society, and we are not confronting it the way it is. Why is it man? You know, what is happening to man? You know, and it is being exacerbated. I don't know how it is at Wits University, but certainly at the University of Johannesburg, we are graduating more women. Women are doing better academically than men. If you just go and look at the average marks, the graduation rates, and so on and so forth. And of course, that alienation to patriarchy, because many of these young men were raised in a patriarchal society, and when you know when something that is as determining on who is going to lead in the future as education is actually being excelled by women, that alienation, I'm just theorizing, maybe it manifests itself as violence, but whatever it is, it has to stop, you know, and we have to stop it. And then when it comes to Trevor, I think I've handled the issue of African leaders leading in the 21st century. I talk about Kwame Nkrumah. I have a chapter 35 on Kwame Nkrumah. And I have Walter Khubusana. You know, Walter Khubusana is one of the leading lights in South Africa. I cannot read Isi Xhosa, but the book that he wrote, Magwalandini, is still a to-go-to book. I bought it not because I could read it, Zemki Nkomo Magwalandini, just because it just looks, it elevates my sophistication to have that book on my bookshelf. I also talk about Mangaliso, Robert Sobukwe. You know, I once tweeted a true story, by the way, when I was a member of the PAC, the ANC, and AZAPO, all at the same time. You know, and many people say, but you know, that is multiple identities. I say, I was only 17 years old. I wanted to find out for myself which path I should actually take, you know. And Mangaliso Sobukwe is definitely one of my favorite leaders. Eric Mulobi, of course, I'm only mentioning men here because I've already mentioned women leaders that are included there in the book. Richard Mapone, and part of the reason, part of the fault line about our attitude towards leaders in South Africa and in Africa is that we tend to think that leaders are actually politicians. You know, leaders are our teachers, are our leaders. If you want to see the character of any nation, go to its classroom. Our kids are spending hours with our teachers, 8 hours every day during weekdays, and we don't think these people are leaders. You know, people in the arts. You know, Trevor, I took three classes on acting when I was an undergraduate in mechanical engineering. And I even acted on My Children, My Africa as Tami Mbikwana, you know. So leaders in the arts, leaders in our communities, in our churches, traditional leaders, you know. At one stage when I was a dean and somebody from a village was really threatening violence against my mom, you know, and I went to the registrar and she showed me the Brixton police station to go and report the case, I knew that, you know, the Brixton police station is not going to help this thing. I went home to my chief, and my chief is not a man. My chief is a woman, you know, and she's the best chief that we have ever had, better than a father, I can confirm. And the issue was actually resolved, you know. So leaders are in every sector of our society, and societies that work are societies that have leaders distributed across the spectrum of our society.
Prof, you have 1 minute remaining, so we can just engage the questions from the platform.
I'm done.
Oh, you're done. All right. Thank you so much for that response in terms of the various perceptions and perspectives that came from both Karaba and Trevor. So I'm just going to move through to the Q&A section and just see if there are any questions from that side. All right, and we get from Tamang Lewis is asking, Prof Tshilidzi, why is there still a leadership brain drain in Africa, even now in the so-called post-colonial times? Is that the fact that the West has money? Recently, 2 of Africa's COVID-19 experts left the continent. Dr. John, the former Africa CDC, left for USA, and Dr. Chikwe, who headed the Nigerian Center for Disease Control. And lastly, Dr. Siso CBC leaving for Cambia in Australia. So I think the question there is, why is there still a leadership brain drain in Africa, even now in the so-called post-colonial times? Prof, that is for you.
Well, I mean, I will have to invoke Marx, you know. Marx, when he was analyzing society, the Marxists are materialists. They are the people who believe that materials actually move the world. And if, and before then, the dominant school of thought was what was called idealists. These are people who believe that ideas are going to move the world. I think it's a combination of both. But when Marx came up with the concept of material, he said a very important statement that the aim of understanding the world, the aim is just not to, the aim of philosophers is to understand the world, but the point is to change it, you know. And what people don't realize, he was talking about changing it in material form. So the material actually, you know, moved the world, you know. It moves the world, you know. And the reason why, when we were overseas during our time, that South Africans had a higher rate of returning back than Nigeria, for Nigerians, for example, was because the material conditions in South Africa were better than material conditions in Nigeria, for example. None of my classmates in Nigeria that I know of from Nigeria actually came back. You know, they live in the United States, they live in all sorts of places. And I even know a prominent person whom I'm not even gonna name the name of, because all of you know who this person is, that whenever his wife falls pregnant, they fly to United States so that that passport will, you know, so it is really material, you know, and we have to understand that we have to make our society work, you know. If we don't make our society work, we have no hope of keeping our most talented people in our society, you know.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Prof. All right, so I'm just gonna look into the chat box again in terms of the comments and the questions. So there is a comment from Lisikolo, and she's saying, very interesting analysis, especially with how women are disproportionately affected by a multitude of societal issues, but are segregated from decision-making. I'm interested to hear the response to the role of technology where reproductive rights are involved. All right, I don't know if we have anyone from the panelists to take into that and just share their thoughts as far as, you know what, the role of technology. where the reproductive rights of women are involved, of people in general, because when we talk about reproduction now these days, it's a very it's a huge spectrum of knowledge in that respect. So I don't know if from our panelists we have Trevor and Karaba to just speak about the role of technology in terms of the reproductive rights as far as that topic is concerned. All right, and then while we're thinking on that, there is a question as well to say, Prof, that this is Kamogelo Manana saying, Prof, based on what Thabang said, what do you think about what do you think about current day leaders leaving for the West? Also, how do you find the balance between leading the continent to better heights and your own personal aspirations that are possible in the West? Prof, please take that on for us to say what do you think about the current day leaders leaving for the West? Also, how do you find the balance between leading the continent to better heights and your own personal aspirations that are possible in the West?
Yeah,
Possible,
look, I mean,
rather.
yeah, look, I mean, I believe that people have the rights to make choices that are better for themselves. You know? So I don't want to impose my own ideological or personal tastes on other people. You know? I would say that if somebody and one of my students, my recent PhD graduates, is going to be going to the Queen Mary University of London as an academic there. In fact, he's from Wits University now. And all the best, you know. Hopefully you are not going to forget where you come from. That's all I can say, you know, because you are free to choose. My responsibility as a leader is to make sure that I create a working environment that will minimize the migration of people, you know. And of course, you can only do so much, you know, because when they leave the workplaces, they operate in society with all the ills of societies that you can imagine, you know. And so those are my views. Maybe just on the issue of reproduction, you know, what technology is doing now and is going to do is that we are going to be able to produce babies out of without the biological ways in which we are accustomed to of producing babies. Cloning is not far off. You know, we can clone animals, and cloning basically is like a photocopying machine. You know, they take your DNA and clone an offspring out of it, you know, without the natural ways of doing it, with all its implications. You know, we know about 3D printing and what the Chinese did with those machines, and all the implications that have to come into that have to follow. My worry is that the developers of technology are actually hopelessly inadequate to be able to understand the ethical implications of their discoveries. And in fact, there is more money that is thrown into the development of technology than money that is thrown into the understanding of what harm that technology can be able to do in society. And again, it's all material, because these companies are investing in these technologies for the sole reason of maximizing their utility, if I were to speak in economic terms. You know? So we just need to have a different form of education, and I will emphasize this again, that education must be multidisciplinary. If you are an engineering student and you are not required to read literature, you are being shortchanged, you know, and any other aspects of our society, and you don't understand issues that are confronting you in society, then you are actually shortchanged. Thank you.
All right, so let me just, I think you mentioned a very crucial point as far as, the education part must be multidisciplinary to ensure that, we're raising a generation that is not just going to be employment seekers, but actually be employment creators in that respect. So in moving to the Q&A session now, I see from Tibet Libelwani there, he's asking, is South Africa ready for the fourth IR, given the fact that we still have a large part of our country without access to the internet? And I think I'm just going to marry this with Balsa's question as well to say, how do we give young people the buy-in of education, which is knowledge and power, when so many graduates are sitting at home? So in terms of the 4IR question, to say, are we ready, given the fact that there is lack or less access as far as the internet is concerned?
No.
Are we ready as a country?
No, I think the answer is yes and no, and I will talk about that. And before I answer that, I really just need to expand on I'm a big critic of South African education system. And sometimes when I go to classrooms, and I used to teach a course in artificial intelligence at Wits University from 2003 to 2008.
Yes.
I have often wondered, how in the world do our students actually succeed? You look at the size of the classrooms, you look at the interactions between the students and the professors. Many professors don't even know who they are. I always give an example that when I was an undergrad in the United States, and my grandmother died, all my professors called me to console me and to tell me that they are going to help me. All my professors called me.
Yes.
It goes without saying that the system allowed for professors to be closer to the students. And because of our large classrooms and so on and so forth, I very often find that education for many of our students is a very painful exercise.
Yes.
They're just an anonymous person in a classroom, and sometimes the professors even threaten them, as if the matrix is to fail rather than to succeed. So now, and this goes back to this issue of multidisciplinary. If we don't give you freedom to go and the Americans call it open electives, to actually go and take courses that you are really passionate about, as part of your requirement to graduate, courses that you can't wait to go to the classrooms, whether it is literature, whether it is theater, whatever it is, then it is no longer education, it becomes instrumental. And what ultimately happens is that you have people who have been so tortured by education that it decapacitates them from playing a meaningful role in our society. And that contributes to unemployment that you talk about. Now, the answer is yes or no. If you live in Johannesburg, you probably have better access to technology. You probably are fully connected to many of the technological offerings that somebody who is living in Berlin actually has. But if you come from my village, I come from a small village called Dutuni in Limpopo province. And when, my MTN network does not quite work, I can't do many of the things that many young people, I'm not saying I'm young, I'm just talking about what young people do on social media, whether it is Instagram and so on and so forth. I can't do that, and I can't help but realize that there are a whole lot of people who are digitally excluded. It's not that we don't have a plan, we actually have a plan. When we were setting up our telecommunication company, we knew that because of the profit motive of companies, they're not going to invest in rural areas as as dynamically as they invest in urban areas. And we created an organization called the Universal Services Agency, where every company, telecommunication company, gives 1% of its revenues to it. And if you go and find out what the Universal Services Agencies is all about, you're going to read more about corruption than anything else. So we need to include our people for that no to become a yes.
All right. I think the last question to you, Prof, is from Bafana Mahali, and he's saying, Prof, what's your take on the lack of the development of the African languages in relation to the lack of leadership within the African context? Might this be contributing to the pertinent colonial matrix of power that restricts young and aspiring Africans? So what is your take on the lack of development of the African languages in relation to the lack of leadership within our context?
Look, I mean, the language is political, you know,
yeah,
and very ideological. And my views on language is actually very different from the views of many South Africans on languages. I don't think we have 11 official languages in South Africa. I think Sepedi and Setswana and Sesotho Savurwa is actually one language. Different dialect.
Interesting observation. Very interesting observation.
You're catching in my studio. Oh my word. But you're correct. You're correct. They're dialects. They're actually dialects of one linguistic group. You are correct.
Yeah.
And I define a different language. If you are a Motswana and you have never really had an exposure to Sesotho Savurwa, and you walk into that area and you can understand almost everything they say, on what basis are you going to call them different languages? You know?
Yeah.
On what basis are you going to? And the same thing with Nguni languages. You know, of course, Nguni languages are spoken even outside South Africa. You even have new Nguni languages. You know, Shangaan, Tsonga is actually half Nguni. You know, and you have Nguni language in Zimbabwe. You know. I like what happened in Zimbabwe. And Trevor, you know, looking at your last name, which by the way is a confusing last name because it is quite common also in the part of South Africa where I come from. They used to have, you know, the thing called Shona. Where was Shona created as a language? At Wits University by a professor called Professor Clement Doe, maybe one of the most influential linguists who determined languages in Southern Africa. People don't realize that. You know, he was the first person to write the isiZulu English dictionary. Then he was given a tender. And in Zimbabwe, you had all these many languages. You know, you had Zulu, you had Manika, you had a language where the ruling class in where I come from, the Venda King, will obviously come from there, which is called Karanga, you know. And then he decided that they are going to write one language. It's going to be called Standardized Shona in 1933. And when people go to school, they will be taught that one language. What people do not know is that this standardized Shona, at the beginning, their grandparents couldn't understand it because they were speaking Manika, they were speaking, you know, and of course today, because it has come to one language, we don't realize that. You know? And this is the issue of scaling. I don't think you can develop languages if you don't have scale. You know, if you have a language called Hindi, and by the way, when Hindi was adopted as a national language in India, it was very controversial because many people are saying, this is not even our language, we don't even understand it. You know, there is no way that a language that is spoken by 14 million people will have the same resources as a language that is spoken by 1.4 billion people. You know. And many of these languages, I will give you another example, Japanese. Many people think Japanese, which is a uniformly spoken language in Japan, was always spoken in Japan. No, Japanese, like many other communities, were speaking multiple languages. And when during the Meiji Restoration, when they realized that economies of scale matter, they decided that that language that is spoken in Kyoto is the one that is going to be taught at school, and now you have a unified language. In fact, now I'm going to even be more controversial. In fact, we have one language, which is a Bantu language. I can understand isiZulu because it just sounds so much like my language. If you think hard, you realize that Mubango means the same thing. You know? Mulenje, Mulenze means the same thing. You know? And I go to Uganda, I go to Rwanda. They cannot speak about me while I'm there because I can pick up what they are talking about because it is littered with words from my own language. You know, in Kenya, Arab Moi used to tell his ministers that you have to follow my footsteps. And the Kenyans gave him a nickname, Nyawo. Nyawo means a foot. I mean, everybody will know Nyawo means a foot. But it means a foot in Zululand, it means a foot in Kenya. You know, this one language called Bantu language. Greenberg actually talked about this, that African languages can be divided into 5. And I think we need to have these big languages that have to be taught at our school, so that ultimately we are going to have half a billion people speaking one language, and we can fully develop it in a way that other languages have been.
Absolutely. And I agree. And I love how you are constantly foregrounding the value of education from the classroom level, because that's where the real magic happens. Whatever that happens at the university level is literally secondary, and we need to focus on what happens at that level. So if you need to teach language, it has to be rightfully done from that level of the schooling sector. So thank you so much for highlighting those points, Prof. And also, highlighting the fact that, what teachers are the real heroes to this effect. I'm not trying to be, what's the word that I'm looking for? Biased because I'm within the education sector, but I think you are highlighting very important points to say education, particularly basic education, is very important in driving any progression, any change within any society. So thank you for that, Prof. And I think there's a question for Karaba in the Q&A section. So the question is, Karaba from Palisasira. She's saying, at Karaba, how do we motivate and ascertain young women that they are worthy of taking up space, as most of our youths from the locations believe that certain positions aren't or weren't meant for us as women? How do we ensure that our existence assist in telling those behind us that there is space in the table for them, and most importantly, that women are worthy? Karaba, please take that on for us.
I'm going to address that, Balas, and that's a good point. I'll mention somebody that you might know, Prof, called Aubrey Bletcher. I sat in his maths class in 2000. I sat in that lecture for an entire hour with my hand up. There were hardly any other students with their hands up, and he ignored me. It's like he saw right through me, right? And this is the experience a lot of Black students have, where you're already culturally alienated from the culture of the university. And you show up as a Black girl, and literally, because they don't have a social experience of you other than the help, that even for me, as a woman of my age who's worked in the university and now back as a student, I'll give you another example. I was standing with a 23-year-old intern from the US. She'd come to help us out in the research center. And I had to ask for my office to be moved further away because our corridor is next to the Senate room. So people are always getting lost, looking for the exams office or the Senate room. People are always lost, you know how it is. I'm standing with this much younger person, and everybody was asking me for help. So even the care fatigue, where all this seen, and it translates into the justification for paying us less, but we do more work. So there's so many issues around that, where it's like we need to find ways and means to train all our kids, because the thing is, the abuse of children is all children until they start to develop secondary sexual characteristics. Then it starts diverging in very violent ways, where boys learn to be violent and girls don't value themselves and all of that, right? And they get caught up in transactional relationships and it just gets muddy, right? So I think the only way to do that, number one, is what people like us showing up and actually raising this and speaking when it's time to speak, and not just, okay, out of respect to Prof, let me just keep quiet for a little bit longer because when I start talking, I can go on forever. But we need to be heard, right? It's also encouraging that, and that when we are heard, that we make people sit down and listen, and that can take forever, which is why we also need to be in leadership positions, right? But we get exhausted. By the time you're 40 as a Black woman, you're finished. Ask me, like you're so tired, you know. One of my favorite professors, Professor Tshilidzi, has left the country. So we're suffering from a huge feminist political science of like her generation. We no longer have her as a resource, you know. Which yeah, in terms of with girls, that's why race is important, because right now the fallout of the COVID pandemic has affected women students disproportionately, in the sense that when you're at home, your family doesn't understand what university studies require from you because they don't know the culture and they don't know the demands. And when you're a Black girl sitting alone in your room, nobody lets you rest. You can even say, no, what about it? But they're knocking on the door, you're doing the care work in the house. And that's why residential universities are so important, particularly for marginalized, for Black children, majority of Black kids, because most of them haven't even seen a library or a lab by the time they get here. And particularly for girls for those reasons, where we can make interventions like taking care of their reproductive health, where they have access to reproductive health care at the campus wellness. Even that still runs out. So again, it's different structures, and that the university, especially in South Africa, a university like Wits, needs to recognize that it is not socially catering for white boys with able bodies anymore. It's a university on the hill, and even the architecture is hostile. The lecture rooms are cold, and there's certain things that happen with our bodies where we feel temperature differently depending on the time of the month that it is. So all of those things that we need to actually take our responsibility seriously in terms of the pastoral care element that we have to do as an intervention, because there's so many non-academic factors that affect academic success, that if you're not in a room with a person, you can't pick them up, you know? So, speaking to issues of technology again and 4IR, and I'd raised a question in my response to Professor's book, was on, is there a way that we can actually tap into indigenous knowledge systems and maybe kind of mechanize them? Does 4IR have the potential to get back what we lost? You speak about being about historical materialism, which is something that you write about a lot from perspective. But is there a way that we can take those knowledge systems and somehow, I don't know, automate them, as it were? I'll give you an example. Machilo Modze is a Sangoma, and she's also a nurse, and she's doing a PhD on indigenous house thing, an indigenous, what's it called when you, I'm running out of my English data bundles, it's getting late. Midwifery, right? So the mother's a midwife. 90s, right? So she's looking at that and how that can be, we can use that knowledge as an intervention, especially considering, the levels of obstetric violence and lack of staff when it comes to women having children in our hospital systems. Yeah, those are just people to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, I think, let me just look into the participation, the side, so that we can just get, okay, the chat box to say, all right, so there is a comment from Bafana Mahalo saying, Prof, thanks for the honest feedback and speaking powerful truths in relation to our languages and its impact to leadership. Hashtag development of African languages. All right. And then there is one from Palisa Sira as well to say, I think it's also time this generation starts understanding that there is no need to force young people into professional degrees, as we end up hating these professions and being unemployed. Part of the unemployment statistics, as the fields are usually populated, is important for us to follow our passions, which is very, very true. Now, taking into consideration Tabang Libis is saying that we must give, people some time to talk as far as, putting up their mics up is concerned. So I'm just going to take that to the production team to say, do we allow for hands? Because I think we do have some 5 minutes for people to just, raise their hand and then they can be unmuted. To the production team, do we allow that or for next time? All right. Thank you so much for that, Sis T. All right. And then so the other part in terms of Kabonina is saying, very true, Prof. Swahili and Zulu is almost the same thing. So that was when Prof was talking about the fact that we have one language, which is what? The Bantu language, all right? And then Lesukolo just said in terms of the comment that unfortunately being tortured by education can be directly linked to the culture of education in the Black community. Black students don't go to school to pursue their passions and interests. Our degrees belong to generations before us who were denied tertiary education, all right? There is historical trauma with the relationship Black people have with education. We are confined to choose from a small pool of degrees that can guarantee you success because it's about rapid upward economic mobility over passion. All right, very powerful insights. And in terms of engagements, I think those are very good contributions that we can literally look into as far as this discussion is concerned. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to just thank each and every one of us for just being part of this discussion and just engaging with the on the book. I will just now hand over to the Deputy Dean of Students to give his vote of thanks, and then we can just also understand that it is that time where I must just call this session to come to an end, and then give our Deputy Dean a chance to just give the vote of thanks. But as for me, I'm very much grateful that we had this discussion, just to go through the mind of the Prof himself to say what lessons he obtained from the books that he read, and just for him being generous in sharing those lessons with us. So let me just not say too much thank you because, wow. Yes, thank you so much for that, Karaba. Yes, so let me just not do the vote of thanks myself and just give it to the Deputy Dean, and then we can just take it from there. Deputy Dean, over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Program Director, and thank you so much, Professor Marwala and members of the panel. Prof. Marwala, you have went overboard. Actually, sitting here, I was just reflecting, say that, what else haven't you read? Because you took us from reading the classics that you reflected upon. One couldn't think of the Vice Chancellor who has read the classics of Machiavelli, moving to read the African literature of Tweni Achebe, and probably in your concluding remarks that you have made to say that if any of us are probably in this undertaking this journey of education and being not encouraged to interact with literature as being shortchanged, made me to think that probably you've also interacted heavily with the work of Amilcar Cabral, who puts out to the fore the importance of theory as a weapon. And this makes me think to say that what you're saying is quite very pivotal, because as you go further with your studies, you are then expected to interact with literature as you're writing for your MAs or your master's programs, whereas that does not start at the foundation level. Thank you very much, Prof, for inspiring us and reflecting deeply on your book and emphasizing that knowledge can only be acquired by interacting massively with literature in a multidisciplinary manner, and that knowledge cannot be acquired from a binary kind of thinking setup where you think white or black, but it's multidisciplinary and quite diverse. Thank you so much, Prof, for making time to come and interact with us and sharing generously your thoughts with the books that you read, and emphasizing the importance of leadership in all stratas of our society, be in church, ecumenical sectors, education, in higher education. So for those of our students who are in this particular room, they must reflect deeply, because there is quite an insistence to say that they are going to inherit these institutions of Ireland. Therefore, a challenge is even much bigger, that you must even read in a multidisciplinary manner, as Professor Marwala has reflected. To members of the panel, Trevor Muzonga, as well as Karaba Koleng, thank you so much for reviewing extensively and sharing your insights with what Professor Marwala has penned down. And we really appreciate the manner in which you have percolated your thoughts. You have even made us think deeply with what Prof Marwala has written, needs not necessarily to be accepted as it is, but to be looked at from a different angle. Thank you so much for the work, that wonderful work that you have done. So on behalf of the Office of the Dean of Students and the entire Student Affairs, led by our Dean of Students, Jerome September, we thank you so much, all of you colleagues and Professor Marwala, who came through tonight to be part of this initiative of the clubs. We again are encouraging our students to look out of the emails for the upcoming book club that is going to be driven from the Office of the Dean of Students. Thanks to Sistembi, thanks to Rebecca for the wonderful work that they are going to be, they are continuing to be doing in this particular space. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you so much, Deputy Dean. We truly appreciate that part. Now comes the good part of our webinar, our discussion, which is the giveaway. You know, we've seen the participation, we've seen the engagement, and you know what? We're even, you know, thrown to the deep end in terms of the questions that have been asked, and we truly appreciate the contributions, the questions, you know, and the comments as far as the discussion, you know, is concerned. You all made it very, very interactive, and we appreciate that. So right now, I'm going to give it away to Rebecca Mhaula, who is also coming from the Dean's office, to give us the names of the people that have the opportunity to collect this amazing book by Prof from the Dean's office. Once your name is called, I think it will then be an opportunity for you to go and collect it from the Dean's office. Rebecca, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Palisa. Good evening to everybody. So the students who will be receiving the book giveaways, signed copies by the author, professor himself, are the following: Palisa Sera, Tibedi Libilwani, Tabang Libisi, Lisiholo, Bafana Mohale, Lucia Ramuva, Kamukhelo Manana, and Dagalo Mapanda. Thank you so much to everybody who participated and was part of this webinar. These copies will be available from our office next week for the students to pick them up. Thank you so much, Palisa and everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.